All right, guys, thank you so much to whoever may be watching this. Just a little bit of reflection on The Colonizer and the Colonized by Albert Memmi here. So we'll start by thinking about the notion of the colonizer, because that's where Memmi starts in his first few sections. He's really thinking about the plight of the colonizer and suggesting that the colonizer is at a constant place of tension as he recognizes his position, though he isn't necessarily inclined to recognize his position, and that is his privilege. His privilege is that he does not necessarily have to recognize his positionality as a colonizer, whereas the colonizee have no privilege to reject their colonizee status, right? A colonizer does have the privilege to live in kind of ignorant bliss should they choose to do so. However, as a point that I'll be making in my final paper, there is an increased awareness and it is becoming increasingly difficult to live in this place, which I would suggest is a good thing, right? That we need to be aware. We cannot live in ignorance of our colonial history. Um, Though one of the points that he also goes on to make is that the colonizer is not at liberty to reject his position. He says this on page 17, which I thought was very insightful and very important point to make, because it's not a question of wherever I go, can I just like take off my colonial hat and just put on, or take off my colonizer hat and put on my colonial hat. No, Mimi argues that the colonial cannot exist because one cannot fully divorce themselves from their positionality as would be necessary to be a true colonial. Wherever I go, I will be a white man and I will be associated with the privilege and the tumultuous history of the colonial encounter. So, for that reason, the colonial cannot exist. He then suggests that there are two kind of possibilities for the colonizer. He can either accept or he can reject. To reject is necessarily half-hearted, necessarily a half-hearted denunciation of conflict with his own people and with his self. So in order to reject, it would necessarily have to be half-hearted, because a rejection of this is a rejection of privilege, and who would reject privilege? Because privilege is pleasurable. And furthermore, to reject one's own identity is also to reject one's people, to live in a constant state of tension, which again is unpleasurable, which is why one cannot ultimately fully embrace this positionality, regardless of the convictions that you may have regarding the colonial exchange and one's ongoing complicitness in that encounter. To then accept one's positionality as a colonizer, Memmi talks about creating different systems, such as colonial racism, to maintain that distinction. All of this being built upon the fact that the colonial encounter was never intended to fully indoctrinate the colony into the colonial homeland, right? Because to do so would give the colonizer a crisis of identity and would absolve them of their superiority. So the true aim is not to indoctrinate, is not to create one single one world nation. It is rather to dominate and exploit and to maintain these power struggles between the colonizer, who always must be at the top in order to maintain that pleasurable position, and the colonizee, which must always be at the bottom. Um, so yeah, those are some thoughts that I thought were very interesting to think about the plight of the colonized. One of the things that I thought was very interesting is the point that he made on page 92, where the colonizer may be disenchanted with the government, may recognize the ineffectual protection of freedom, and demand reform. However, the colonizee does not have this privilege because they have not known the effectuous government. They have not known the true freedom. And so as a result, they are necessarily limited in their conceptualization of what life should be like in a truly liberative nation. In this way, there is an educational void in the colonized. And ultimately, the faith of the colonized is either to become different or to reconquer. Full assimilation, as I talked about, is impossible and even discouraged by the colonizer. Now, eventually, where Meme gets is that to become different is virtually impossible, which is a big part of what I'm going to be talking about in my term paper. It's almost impossible to be fully different because there is an economic investment by the colonizer to maintain the positionality of the colonizee. So to fully become different, to fully become independent, one must be liberated from this transnational capitalistic enterprise, which is very hard, and nobody seems to have been able to do it. So as a result, the only other fate is to reconquer or to revolt, which is inevitable, which is kind of where he leaves off in his book. Um, yeah, so then thinking about Roger Green's video, he had a lot of thoughts on this. I specifically watched lecture 22, which only talked about chapter one of Does the Colonial Exist? He talked a lot about the ongoing colonial romance, and also the aestheticization of the foreign, which I thought was very interesting. Basically romanticizing this colonial exchange as some kind of liberative practice where this noble colonizer comes in and saves the colonizee. It's really creating an illusion of the colonial exchange, which is far from truth, which is exploitation of natural resources and domineering power forces, right? I thought it was very interesting how when he talked about his classes, everyone in the class saw themselves as colonized in some way and not colonizer. I think this is a big issue of what Memmi is trying to get at in this book, is that there has to be an increased awareness of the colonizer, of their positionality, and a rejection of the chronic victimization, which many in our contemporary society have become so comfortable and addicted to, right? Everyone wants to be a victim, but no one is willing to be kind of the aggressor. Where if we're being honest with ourselves, most of us, especially in the West, are the aggressors historically. Um, he talked about the privilege and inheritances that they never asked for, consciousness raising specifically on page 8, and the internal intentional whitewashing of history and selective amnesia of what's going on. So in order to maintain this illusion that like those of us who are in the West, the previous colonizers are not complicit and are not participating in in ongoing colonial exchange, we whitewash history, we romanticize it, and we engage in a selective amnesia in order to forget and absolve ourselves not only of our ongoing crimes, but also of our generational crimes. And that's a big theme of what the way that Roger Green approaches this is very intergenerational thinking, right? He does raise a lot of attention to the fact that these generations are not so far off. We're really thinking 2 or 3 generations prior when explicit notions of colonial expansion and colonial oppression are taking place. And so, in order to get just a few generations down the line and to not remember this and to really try and reject our ongoing position in this exchange is a result of selective amnesia and historical whitewashing. Um, some of the other things. Oh, when thinking about current events, I thought it was very interesting to think about Ukraine and attempted colonization by Russia. I know that like this probably seems super obvious, but I hadn't thought of Russia as necessarily trying to colonize Ukraine, but more so as just trying to I don't know, consume them, to like get control over their natural resources of their population. But really, when you think about it, it is a colonial exchange. But then the question that I have then is any kind of like historical expansion by any nation a colonial exchange? What sets out a colonial expansion versus just a typical militant expansion, right? Or is that just the history of the world is just constant colonization over and over again, and really questioning to what degree the native culture is able to maintain its integrity throughout these expansive processes. Is every time a nation consumes a new land, grows or shrinks, is every time that happens an instance of colonialism, or is colonialism unique in the fact that it compromises the cultural integrity of the previously uncolonized is a big question that I'm really thinking about here. So I know I'm getting close to my time. Another last thing that I thought was really interesting that they talked about was the split between the church and colonialism. One of the things that Memmi talks about on page 73 is that the colonialist could not favor an undertaking which would have contributed to the disappearance of colonial relationships. Conversations of the colonized to the colonizers religion would have been a step towards assimilation, and that is one of the reasons why the colonial mission failed. Essentially, the evangelistic efforts of colonizers failed because in order to fully accept the religion of the colonizer would be a step towards assimilation, which, as Memmi has already pointed out, assimilation is problematic because it then compromises the power dynamics that are at play and the capacity that the colonizers have to continually exploit the colonizee. And so it's for that reason that the religious expansion did not necessarily happen the way that many missionaries thought that it would. I know that I'm over my time by about 20 seconds. Thank you so much for watching. Those are some of my thoughts, and I look forward to talking more in class soon. Peace.